Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. This is part 3 of the 6th lecture series on Counterhistory and the Anecdote by Greenblatt and Gallagher. Out of the 3 parts that I mentioned in the first lecture, this is part 2. We have already covered what anecdotes are, why they are a favored device of the counterhistorians, of the new historicists. Also, what are the distinguishing factors of an anecdote, that it gives view of the personal account of individual lives, of small events that counterhistory is made up of. Also, we've covered which kind of anecdotes the new historicists were looking for. They were looking for outlandish and weird and out of place anecdotes that promise to puncture the grand narratives. So this is all that we have covered through the previous 2 lectures. This is the 3rd one, and in this we are going to cover British radical history, British radical left-wing history. Of that, Greenblatt is going to give you a couple of examples. So I'm going to start right ahead with the text of the essay. The new historicists wanted to bring a cultural approach to the study of history and literature. For that cultural approach to history, anecdotes served as a perfect medium. Here again, Greenblatt says that in Britain also, where British left-wing historians were trying to bring a culturalist approach to history, were trying to bring a humanist approach to history, where the center of history, the focus of historical narratives would no more be huge political systems, but the culture of a particular time, place and era. So the anecdote became a hallmark of this kind of history, because the anecdote was bringing the same elements into the study of history which these historians wanted to bring in. For example, these historians wanted to emphasize on personal experience. So how could we study personal experiences? Through the medium of anecdote. They wanted to bring in the aspect of social consciousness into their history, which was absent before. So how could we study the social consciousness of a particular people, particular time? We could study the anecdotes of that particular period and place. And how the world making means how a worldview is formed in the minds, in the perceptions of readers and people through the modes of literature and other narratives, other kind of writing. So they wanted to see how this process of world making goes through in the minds of people, and the anecdote served as a perfect medium for it, because it actually presented accounts, real accounts of all this happening, of people's personal experiences, of the forming of social consciousness, of the process of world making. The anecdotes provided real stories, complete accounts of all of this happening, and therefore the culturalist or humanist British left-wing historians found the anecdote to be a perfect medium. There was 2 kinds of history that was going on, historical writing that was going on at that particular point of time in Britain. One was the radical culturalists who were adopting the anecdotal methods, who were picking up anecdotes and were trying to create a narrative through the anecdotes. They were trying to create a countercurrent to the normal history through the anecdotes. This was one method, and this method stood against the normal traditional way of writing history. This was the continuous unidirectional history posited by both liberal academic history and determinist Marxism. So who was standing against these radical culturalist historians? They were the academic historians who were writing history in the normal academic way that history is being written for such a long time, and determinist Marxism. Determinist Marxism means a kind of Marxism that is strictly following the rigid notions, rigid principles propagated by Marxism in the beginning. So these 2 kinds of history were standing against the radical history that relied on anecdotes, whereas this liberal academic history and determinist Marxism that showed that history was some sort of linear, unidirectional, unconflictual, continuous system of change. Now, before moving on to telling you about E.P. Thompson, I must tell you who he was. E.P. Thompson was an English historian, a British historian, who worked within the Marxist framework but had a fresh subject that he represented, that he brought into the purview of historical writing. He chose the most ignored, the most ridiculed, the most mistaken of the subjects of the English working class. So he picked these people up as a subject, and what he did, he chose these subjects that were weird, outlandish. Remember, he chose these anecdotes, he brought them into the purview of history. He was striving to present previously disregarded historical subjects, those subjects which were not regarded enough to be considered as historical subjects previously by other historians. And he wanted to give an access to the multiplicity of pasts, that he wanted to display that there was not just one past, there were many pasts, and there were pasts of people who were not represented, who were not spoken for, who did not speak through history. He wanted to bring these people and bring their original voices to the historical analysis he was creating, and thus he wanted to create counter histories of these people as well. He wanted to give the most mistaken of his historical subjects the dignity of full hearing. So he brought in the poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan. These are the categories I am reading out from the next line that Greenblatt mentions, that Thompson wrote. So he brought all these 5 categories that have been mentioned: poor stockinger, the Luddite cropper, the obsolete handloom weaver, the utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott. So I'll take the first 4 categories first, and then I'll come to the 5th category. The first 4 categories, the stockinger, cropper, the handloom weaver, and artisan, these were the people who relied on their hands to create whatever they were creating. They were not using machinery. In fact, these were the people who were protesting the use of too much machinery. Now I come to the 5th category, the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott. Now, who was Joanna Southcott? She was an equivalent to all the Swamis, the gurus that we have in India, that so many people blindly follow. There were at least 14,000 people who followed Joanna Southcott, who was a sort of a prophet who used to make prophecies. She prophesied that the world will come to end in the year 2004. Also, these 14,000 followers had some people who would not even take a single important step without her permission, without having first consulted with her. So this was the kind of impact that Joanna Southcott had on some people, and these people were considered too naive, too innocent to stay under the influence of a semi-literate peasant girl who just proclaimed to be a prophet. But E.P. Thompson took even these people seriously. He wanted to even study even their stories. What was their consciousness like? He wanted to bring them all in, and he wanted to save them from getting lost. This is what it means when he says he wanted to save them from the enormous condescension of posterity. He did not want these stories to get lost. He doesn't want these stories to be silenced forever. Now, there are some other subjects that Thompson picked up. They were the food rioters, the Muggletonians, William Blake. Why is William Blake considered a subject that has been misrepresented or underrepresented? Actually, William Blake also had visions. He also thought that he saw some supernatural visions, prophecies. So he was also somewhat considered obscure, not normal by people. And Thompson picked William Blake as a subject of his study as well within the purview of historical analysis. He studied the food rioters of the 18th century. We'll come to that later. He came to Muggletonians. What were Muggletonians? Muggletonians were people who followed after Lodowick Muggleton, who was a 17th century self-proclaimed prophet. He and another person who were called the Muggletonians in the beginning professed that they were two saints from the Bible. They were the last two prophets from the Bible. See, these are the obscure figures that Thomson brought in to be studied as serious subjects of historical analysis, and he did it with an ordinary Marxist framework. But Thomson was looking for, number one, a suspension of previous theoretical presuppositions. He wanted to, first of all, for some time, for readers to suspend the previous theoretical suppositions, previous theoretical statements, whatever we believed in theoretically before this, he wanted us to suspend that for a moment. What was these presuppositions about? About the essential determinants of historical processes. That determining history is not so rigid and fixed that you study the relation between the factors of production and then you come to a fixed result. Historical analysis, historical processes are not this rigid. He says that we should have an openness, historians should have an openness to the historical documents. All kinds of historical documents should be considered with open mind by the historian. We read in the very beginning of this essay, while I was introducing New Historicism to you, that the most distinguishing factor of New Historicism was now they considered every document to be a social production. So here we are. E.P. Thompson says that every historian should have an openness of mind when it comes to historical documents, and they should have a willingness to dwell in history's dead ends. And he said that we should have a willingness to keep lingering on, to stay in those dead ends, to stay around. And if we stay around long enough, we'll definitely find something that has been silenced, that has been hidden in those dead ends. And also he wanted to keep one's ears open. Now he's talking to historians that we have to keep our ears open. We cannot close our ears to the people, to the voices that seem ridiculous, unconventional, that seem too out of fashion. We can't close our ears to them. They also deserve a dignity of full hearing. So he says that the historian has got to be listening all the time. The historians should have their ears open all the time. They should have a sympathetic ear, a sympathetic point of view to all that's coming along in their way. The material has got to speak through them, means that when the historian speaks, they speak whatever has been recovered by them in those dead ends of history. So, do we see a hint of whatever was said in part first of this essay in this very incident? What I'm saying is that Greenblatt mentioned that new historicists need a different kind of anecdotes, the anecdotes that were weird, outlandish, that promise to puncture on purpose. The anecdotes about these people, the food rioters, Muggletonians, William Blake, obsolete handloom weaver, utopian artisans, followers of Joanna Southcott, are these people not an example of that weirdness, the outlandishness that the new historicists sought in their anecdotes? And this is why exactly E.P. Thompson's work has been included in this part of this essay. Now, Thomson did not want paraphrase. For Thomson, paraphrasing was never the answer for historical analysis. He wanted the readers to take the past in its own term. He did not want to create an abstraction of translation into standard 20th century prose. He did not want to obscure the incidents, the anecdotes in 20th century prose. He did not want to sort of normalize the anecdotes into narratives. He did not want a normal traditional teleological narration of the anecdotes that usually formed the work of other historians at the time. His method involved estrangement of the reader. The reader finds the incident very, very strange. The creation of surprise, the reader is surprised, and conceptual dissonance, as if the reader does not understand what's happening, was the key to his method. This was the key to Thompson's method. He particularly relished marginal language that was dense, specific, misspelled, and ideologically irretrievable. He preferred incidents and anecdotes in their original language, and the language was better in its original state. If there was misspelling and the language was so dense and in such unconventional English, such unconventional language that it was hardly easy to understand, it was a perfect material for Thompson's work. He relished marginal language, a language that is not normal. This kind of language was ideologically irretrievable. You cannot fix what ideology this language is portraying, what stream of thought this language is showing you, what kind of preferences this person who's speaking is making. So he gives you an example of this short text that's written in a very weird English, and this text was found in the London Gazette of the 18th century. So this text reads, and I'm going to read it for you. Your bailier steward proper is a blackguard sort of fellow to the workmen, and if you don't discharge him, you may look to your house being set on fire. If stones will not burn you, damned son of a whore, you shall have your throat cut from ear to ear, except you lay L50 under the second tree of staple Nash's from his house at the front of the great gates near the rabbit warren on Wednesday morn next. Now, definitely you must have observed that this is not normal English. Blackguard, the spellings are wrong. If you don't, the comma is missing. You may look to your house, the capitalization is all wrong. House being set on fire, set has double T's. If stones will not burn you, you damned son of a whore. And suddenly there's a change of tone. It's becoming abusive, as if the writer the speaker has not really decided what he did not have a set agenda to deliver a sort of speech. He was speaking whatever was coming to his mind. There's a sense of spontaneity to this writing. So, you son of a whore, you shall have your throat cut from ear to ear. And then it comes to blackmailing. You lay a particular amount of money under a certain tree on Wednesday morn next. Perhaps he's saying Wednesday morning, the next Wednesday morning. So this is unconventional writing, and Thompson brought it into his discourse as the writing is, as it is. The original voice was sort of visible, sort of audible in the text that Thompson created. Now, Thompson likes this voice because it has a paradoxical effect. And what is the paradoxical effect? That at the same time, the voice seems immediate, to the point, and is felt through its strangeness. At the same time, it's so strange. You understood in a moment whatever the guy was trying to say. But at the same time, the language that he was using, the way that he was talking, the way he was changing his tone was very strange. In fact, this text has deviant textuality. The textuality, the quality of the text is not normal. It's quite different from normal textuality. There are wrong spellings, there's lack of punctuation, and this is what makes the voice audible. It is because of this that the voice becomes audible. It is because of the original voices being included in the text that we actually, when the words were being spoken, I could hear the person speaking. And since there are certain orthographic conventions missing, some norms that we use to write are not followed, the reader must subvocalize. When you read this text alone, you'll have to quite vocalize this text. You have to stop where there are stops, and you have to produce meaning in an extraordinarily active manner. The reader is involved more than normal. If I give you this text to read, it will take more effort from your side to understand this text. You will be more involved. You will have to read out loud to really be able to understand this. So there's a more involvement of the reader, and therefore the language seems intimately inside the reader. Since you are so involved, you are reading out loud, you're vocalizing or sub-vocalizing, this language seems inside the reader, unusually palpable. It seems as if it's more present. It's more audible than normal language in strict proportion to its foreignness. And although it's very, very foreign for us as well, we don't use this sort of language spellings and conventions. It's at the same time strange, but at the same time inside us, inside the reader, and that's what the paradox is. This text breaks all the conventions that we have been so strictly asked to follow. Now we see that beginning by requesting the redress of grievances against the addressee steward, the voice quickly moves to insults and threats against the landlord himself, and concludes with rather business-like directions about where to leave the blackmail money. So this is how the text went. So Greenblatt says, the less predictable the voice is, the less recognizable as a voice from our past, the more it produces the effect of the real. Now this voice was not a voice from our past. We do not recognize it. We do not use these conventions. We do not speak like this. So since it's so different from the normal language that we hear, it creates the effect of the real, something that we haven't heard of. Therefore, it's so real. It does not only exist in a text or a history book. We know that this is something real. And since there's so much difference between their convention and our convention, their way of speaking and our way of speaking, it shows you a gulf that exists, a huge space that exists between that kind of people and us. So we agree that yes, we are not like them and they're not like us. So there is a them and an us. And of course, there's a difference that has been perceived about them and us. And that's how Thompson makes apparent the differences that exist in the society through language, through weird anecdotes. And another difference is that these people lived through those acute time of social disturbance, and we do not. These were the people who suffered the actual problems, the disturbances, the economic problems, the problems of industrialization and other problems that these people faced, and we do not. So we can only sympathize. Although we are using the same words that they were using, we are studying these subjects historically, even then, these were the people who actually suffered the problems. We are the ones who are talking about them. So there'll always be a difference between them and us. Now, we already know that most traditional historians would prefer objectivity. What is objectivity? If I'm writing objectively, I'm writing history objectively, it means that I'm not taking sides. And I'm not taking sides because I'm not really emotionally connected. I want people to know, I want to declare through my writing that I'm not connected to this party or that party. I'm not really sympathetically involved with the subject I'm writing about. So most traditional historians prefer objectivity, the mark of objectivity, more than bringing the touch of the real. The touch of the real comes when you sympathize with your subject, when you bring their original voices, when you respect their original voices, when you consider them worthy enough to be the subjects of history. That's how, through the anecdote, the touch of the real comes into the writing of histories. So there are two opposite aspects to writing history. There are two types of historians involved here that Greenblatt talks about. One are the traditional historians that prefer objectivity, so they are not, they claim that they are not connected. and the other is the person who's writing counter histories, who's bringing the voice of the other, who's bringing the effect of the real through the anecdote. So Thompson is the second type of historian here. Now Greenblatt says that Thompson did follow the prevailing standards of historical practice. He was objective. He was not really writing through his personal perspective, but his rhetoric and methods, the way he approached history, was unabashedly partisan in favor of those who had been slighted and excluded by most historians, and he produced the shock of unfamiliarity to emphasize our ignorance rather than his subjects' availability as objects. Now, Thompson did follow the traditional frameworks, Greenblatt says, but yet he was sympathetic to the people who have been ignored as subjects of history, whose suffering has been completely erased from historical narratives. They have been slighted and excluded by most historians. They haven't been included. And he wanted to produce a shock. When I read that excerpt from the London Gazette, I was shocked. Why was I shocked? Because I haven't heard that sort of language. And why I haven't heard that sort of language? Why people haven't heard that sort of language? Because we have our ignorance. We are unfamiliar with that kind of voice because we haven't really connected with that sort of people. It's not about only the London working class, even in wherever I am, wherever you are. There's a sort of, there are always working class people who we are not connected with, the way they live, the kind of language they use, the ways they follow. We are unfamiliar with them. That shows our ignorance of them. And Thompson wanted to bring that kind of voices into historical narrative, create a shock to the people who are so used to normal historical narratives. And he wanted to emphasize our ignorance. Here, he was not really concerned about showing that yes, these people are objects of history. He was concerned about showing us, showing me and you and all the readers that read his work, that we are ignorant of a certain set of people in our own society. We are distant from them, and if people like Thompson would not write about them, they would be completely erased from history. And that's the condescension of posterity that Thompson was earlier talking about, that they'll be lost forever, and Thompson did not want that to happen. So Greenblatt writes, he happily violated, we are talking about Thompson of course, he violated a methodological taboo by thus determining not to judge the behavior of common Britons by the putatively objective standards of later historical developments, but instead to retrieve their own rationales, their understandings in the moment, and to present them in the most favorable possible light. So he did not want to again judge these people from the normative standards, from the normal historical methods that we've talked about these people. He wanted to bring their original rationales. What were they thinking? What was their voice saying? What did they actually say? How did they actually say it? What was the emotion in that saying? Were they angry? Were they furious? Were they feeling ridiculed? He wanted to bring the original voice, to bring all these emotions to the reader. He wanted to show their understandings in the moment. Now, Greenblatt wants to emphasize two aspects of Thompson's work. Number one was that Thompson wasn't only claiming that he is bringing to the readers a social reality that was ignored. Of course, he was doing that. But he wasn't claiming that he was only doing that. He wasn't only bringing a sort of social reality to the readers, he was also bringing a social imaginary to readers. What is the difference between social reality and social imaginary? That this class of people, this set of people who suffered and were ignored, they did exist. So he was bringing into the historical narrative this kind of people, this kind of subjects. but he was also trying to imagine a moral economy. Now, those who know Thompson's work know that Thompson worked on the moral economy of the working class. What is moral economy? That economy shouldn't only be based on rigid structures of factors of production. Economy should also have a moral aspect to it. For example, if there's a drought and the crop is not plenty and there's a shortage of food, what should happen? Profit should not be the focus when there's a shortage of food. The focus should be eradicating hunger of every class of people. But in an economy, even when there's a shortage of food and the food is sent to the markets to be sold, rather than being distributed among the people who are hungry, whose children are hungry, the people whose children go hungry are bound to get unhappy, obviously. And the historians who do not show why this set of people was unhappy are again writing only from a very normative perspective. They are not bringing personal sufferings into the narrative, which Thompson was trying to do. Thus, he was writing the history of what could have been, what should have happened. If there was a shortage of food, the food should have been distributed among the lower classes first, and then the remaining food, if any, should have been sent to the markets. But this did not happen. So he wanted to emphasize on the moral economy that could have existed. So Greenblatt says that although Thompson was following the same methods of writing history that most of his counterparts were following, and yet he was exercising his sympathetic imagination. He was sympathetic to a certain set of people and he was applying his imagination to fill in the gaps. So there were some blanks left by other historians. Some historians did not take into account some aspects of the society, some aspects of the lower class anger. Thompson took note of their suffering. He brought them into historical narratives. And he also exercised his imagination to fill in why these people behaved the way they behaved and what should have happened. And by doing this, he was painstakingly building his own grand story of the lower orders. You see that this is also a grand story. He was creating a sort of grand history himself. He also did what other historians were doing, just the difference that he was clinging to the lower strata of the society and the people who have been ignored. So he was doing that, and he never seemed to have doubted his capacity to construct an accurate account of the past. Greenblatt says that even Thomson did not doubt himself that whatever he was saying was completely accurate. He believed that whatever he was saying is completely accurate, completely real. So that's also a flaw that historians have. And Thompson, of course, also had that flaw, creating a grand story of himself and thinking that whatever he was writing is actually accurate. This is what had just happened. Do you see how this connects with the first section of the lecture when I talked about the difference between the referent and the signified, the event that happened and the narrative of that event that was created? Barth says that there's actually a difference between what really happened and the historian's account of it. But here, Thompson still clung to the method of thinking that whatever happened and whatever was written was actually the same. So this is also again could be perceived as a flaw in his writing. And yet, nevertheless, Greenblatt writes, the very nature of his enterprise required him to reconstruct not only what happened but also what might have happened. Since he applied his sympathetic imagination, he reconstructed not only what happened but what might have happened. The way markets behaved is what happened. But the way the markets should have behaved when there was shortage of food is what might have happened. So here he applies his sympathetic imagination. If the people were considerate enough, if the ruling people, if the people who controlled the means of production and the means of marketing their products, if they were sympathetic enough, they would have thought about people first and profits later. This might have happened. This is what should have happened. Thompson brought this aspect into his writing of history, and that's why he is considered to be a great writer of counter-histories. For example, consider Thompson's essays on the food riots of the 1790s, riots that looked futile and self-destructive in the hindsight of most late 20th century economic historians, who traced the inevitable breakdown of local markets, the standardization of grain prices, and the capitalization of agriculture. Most historians considered these riots as futile, of no result, and also self-destructive, that people who were rioting were harming themselves. Also, they studied some economic features of the riot. The economic features like breakdown of local markets. There was a breakdown of local markets. There was a standardization of grain prices. The grain prices were standardized. And the capitalization of agriculture, how agriculture was capitalized. So in this activity of charting the necessary sequence of social and economic history, Marxists and non-Marxists were equally zealous. So every historian, whether Marxist or non-Marxist, what were they trying to do? They want to elaborate, they want to discuss the sequence of social and economic impacts of this event, of these food riots. What was the social impact? What was the economic impact of the riots? And this is what they included in their historical narratives. In contrast, how was Thompson different? Thompson attempted to stop the action at the moment of the riots themselves. He actually imagined that we, the readers, or the writer, that Thompson actually was in the moment. We are in the moment when the riots are happening. And he wanted to fill out the structure of an alternative competing economy with different rules and potential for another, albeit unrealized future. He discussed the perspective of the class that rioted. He showed that it was unnatural and immoral, that profit takes preference, that profit was given a priority over the necessities of the working class people, of the peasants. He showed that these communities were shocked. The people who rioted were rioting because they were shocked that when there's a dearth of resources, when there's a shortage of food, and they realize that there are inequalities, that just because they are peasants, just because they are from the lower class of the economic society, they think that they are being treated unequally, that people who are richer are eating food as well as selling the food in the markets, whereas these people go hungry. And that is why the riots happened. And he focused more on this personal aspect of these people, this personal approach of these people who rioted. And though he didn't have first-hand access to the people themselves, of course, he was relying on documents alone. He created a social imaginary, that what might have been, why were these people so angry, and what was their emotional perspective that they rioted. And he knows that these people suspected that the scarcity, the shortage of resources was manipulated, that there was actually no scarcity. Actually, the food that was sold to the markets could have been distributed or be sold at lower prices to the people first who produced it. So, thus the shock becomes fury. Thompson emphasized on this process of this shock transforming into fury and the fury transforming into riots. he was perhaps one of the very few historians who actually focused on this aspect of the riots, not the standardization of grain prices, not the governmental control, not the capitalization of the agricultural practice of the time, but he also focused on the personal approach of these people who rioted. And that's why he was different, and that's why he was a creator of a counter history of these people. I'm going to read whatever I have just explained to you. Greenblatt says the same in the next few lines, so I'm going to read it. Where other historians saw merely the blind reactions of hungry bodies, Thompson saw the as yet undetermined struggle for survival of another cultural formation. There could have been another culture. There was a struggle for survival by these people, a culture where a moral economy, where people's hunger was given more importance than market profits. What did the rioters want? Thompson's imagined that they wanted resources to be treated more morally. They wanted food to be distributed first among the people who actually really badly needed the food, rather than making food a factor in profit. So Thompson imagines the moral economy, an economy that's also moral and not only economic, half lived and half dreamt by the rioters. The rioters wanted to live that sort of economy. They were dreaming of that sort of economy. His counter history from below of the bread riots shades into alternate history. Now, in the first section of this lecture, we talked about alternate history. Alternate history is something that the historian also imagines. He brings in real facts as well, but he also imagines some aspects of it to show what could have happened. So Thompson, by creating his work on the moral economy of the working class, what was the working class trying to achieve and how it was so justified, his counter history of the bread riots, of the riots of the 1790s, was also partly alternate histories. The history of things that did not happen. So what can we conclude from this sort of counter history? There are some points that Greenblatt mentions. Number one, that the present is not necessarily a superior objective vantage point, like from right now where you are standing, right now from where I am standing. If we look at the past and we think that whatever we are concluding about the past, whatever we know about the past is real and accurate, that may not be true. The present where we are standing might not be a superior vantage point from where we can see things clearly. It's not necessarily that. When we look at from the present, when we look at the past incidents, past events, we might be very reductive in our approach, that we are simplifying what happened. We are reducing them to a single statement fact. So this is how the present is not really a very accurate point to stand and be judging what happened in the past. The present might also be a reductive point of looking at the past. Second point that we can conclude from Thompson's work is that social realities are often not singular or even reciprocal, but multiple and incommensurable. Number two is that social realities are not only singular, that whatever happened and whatever we read in history might not be the only thing that happened. Social realities of the past and even of the present may be plural, maybe more than what we read, maybe more than one account. There could have been more approaches to a certain event in history. Social histories are not singular. Also, they're not even reciprocal, that they sold the food in the markets, so the rioters rioted. This is not the only reciprocal relationship that existed. There could have been more to that. And to study the more, we have to bring the original voices in and go against the grain of normal grand historical narratives. And you cannot measure them. You cannot condense them into narratives. Social realities are incommensurable. And number 3 is that the historian must be able to push beyond understanding a past social reality into imagining the social imaginary. That the historian's job is not only to narrate a social reality like normal historians do. According to Greenblatt, the historians should also be able to create a social imaginary, imagining what could have happened, what should have happened. That's also the job of a historian. Historians should not only stick to the normal methodological assumptions of historians, they should also stretch it. They should also apply their imaginary capabilities, and they should imagine a social imaginary as well. And Greenblatt says that this is one of the reasons that Thompson was very interested in studying the visionary poetry of William Blake. What does this mean? It means that William Blake, who had visions, and of course in normal discourse we don't consider visions as something real, we consider them something imaginary, that it's a part of the imagination of the person who was having the visions. Thompson studied his visionary poetry, so obviously he was interested in the imaginary more, or equally at least, that he was considering social realities as well as social imaginaries as well, and that's why he is different from normal historians. So this was one of the ways in which Thompson was different from other historians, and that's why he's considered a historian contributing to counterhistories by Greenblatt. This was one aspect of his writing, that he was creating a social imaginary. Not only a social reality, but also a social imaginary of the things that could have been. That's the first aspect. The second, for which he stands distinguished in Greenblatt's view, is that he was always remarkably ready to see himself not only as the champion of previously unheeded historical voices, but also as a speaker just like them, struggling to be heard against the chorus of establishment historians. So Greenblatt mentions that Thompson felt himself to be a voice of the minority, to be a voice like the people he quoted, because he was himself in opposition with the majority forces in England at that point of time. He was standing against the Cambridge historians with their faith in Namier's England. Cambridge historians stand for the elitist historians of the time, and Namier's England could be considered a representative of the structural methods of studying history. Namier was an elitist theorist who conducted a very structuralist analysis of historical documents, and this is what the Cambridge historians were also bent on doing, that they were creating an elitist sort of history by doing a structural analysis of history. And that's what Greenblatt means when he says that Thompson was standing against the Cambridge historians, because Thompson himself was creating a social imaginary. He was bringing the forces of imagination to historical analysis. So Thompson was standing against the Cambridge historians and also the Althusserian Marxists. By bringing Althusser into this narrative, Greenblatt perhaps wants to hint that there were Marxists who were relying on rigid Marxist principles for doing historical analysis. Thompson was not doing that. He wasn't really relying on any particular set of Marxist principles to create his own historical narrative. Therefore, Thompson, since he was going against the majority voices of the time, he found his voice to be singular and pugnacious, feeble and perhaps struggling, like the voices of the people he chose to represent, like the voices of the people he did not only choose to represent, but also he quoted in original. And thus, Thompson became an example, a model, a guiding light for the new left historians. And what were the qualities that made Thompson a guide, a star for new left historians? His powerful authorial persona. When he wrote, in his writing, his authorial persona, his own personality, was evident. It was so powerful. His defiant, anti-professional will to represent. He wanted to represent the people he chose to represent, but his ways were defiant. He was not following the set methods. He was defying the set methods. He was anti-professional. He was not following the professional methods of history making. He was driven with a will to represent, but he was defying the methods, the historical, the traditional methods, and he was anti-professional. He shunned all pretense. He was not pretending that he was not pretending that he was very, very objective and that he has no connection with his subjects, and that whatever he was writing was totally not driven by any party's interest. He was not pretending to be that. He was not claiming value-free objectivity, and therefore he became a model of heroic history making for a generation of new left historians. So Thomson became a model for the new left historians because of the above qualities that he showed.